Good evening and welcome to this week's session of People of Interest. We are deeply honored to have our guest of honor with us, Professor Kurtzer. Professor David Kurtzer is an anthropologist, a historian, and an academic leader specializing in the political and demographic history of Italy. He authored The Pope and Mussolini, which was the winner of the 2015 Pulitzer Prize for Biography, and is the professor at Brown University. Professor Kurtzer's The Kidnapping of Edgardo Martoro was a finalist for the National Book Award in 1997, a fantastic book I would highly recommend among all of his books. And in 2016, Steven Spielberg announced that he would be making a film based on that particular book. Tonight's talk, titled The Pope, the Jews, and the Secret Archives, will address the long and complicated relationship between the Vatican and the Jews. The format for tonight will be a Q&A. So sit back, relax, and enjoy what promises to be a fascinating evening and discussion with Professor Kurtzer. Welcome, Professor.
Nice to be with you.
And thank you so much for taking the time. I know this is a hectic period, and you have been inundated with requests to speak by Jewish communities and others around the US and the world based on an incredibly popular recent article you wrote in The Atlantic, which we'll get to shortly in the next few minutes. But let me begin with a general question, Professor. Can you give us some background into the Vatican's attitude and efforts during World War II in relation to the fate of the Jews, and in particular the deportation of the Jews of Rome in 1943?
Yes, well, let's try to give a little background. I put together a few slides that I think might help participants understand a little bit better what the history that I'd like to go through. So if we could put up that first slide. Here I just show, as a kind of way of introduction, the main person at the center of what has become such a huge controversy, the controversy over the silence of the Pope during the Holocaust. And this is Pope Pius XII, who becomes Pope in 1939. Next to him, because I want to put this in the context of what was going on in Italy at the time, and as you mentioned, particularly how the Holocaust affected Rome, the Jews of Rome. Here you have a trip that Hitler, I'm sure folks recognize at least two of these three characters. Hitler in the middle, to Hitler's right is Mussolini, and the shorter fellow is King Victor Emmanuel III of Italy. Hitler makes a triumphal visit in the spring of 1938 to Italy. And at the time, there's a Pope Pius XI, who will die several months later, but is actually not very pleased about Hitler for various reasons. The Jews are not the central ones, although he's not happy about Hitler's racism, which he regards as pagan. From the Pope's point of view, the important thing is whether or not you're Catholic, not whether or not you're Aryan. In any case, we go to the next slide. Just to give you an idea of the controversy. The controversy really broke out in public with a play in 1963 by a German playwright you see in the middle there, Rolf Hochhuth. His play represented the Pope as refusing to speak out as the Jews of Europe were being butchered. And the church reacted quite strongly, denying this, defending the Pope. Then in 1999, it got renewed, the debates got renewed, the polemics became fiercer, even with the book by the British journalist John Cornwell's book, Hitler's Pope, with its provocative title. But as I mentioned, there's been very strong defense within the Church of the Pope, who by some of his defenders is even portrayed as one of the Jews' greatest protectors in world history. Here I gave us an example, a film that was made, but there are many other examples that could be given. This is a fairly recent Italian film, 2015, where if you can see, they portray the Pope, this is supposed to be Pius XII, wearing a Star of David and showing solidarity with the Jews during the Holocaust, which of course never happened. One other thing, if we go to the next slide, this relates to is not just the question of the silence of the Pope during the Holocaust, but what made the Holocaust possible in the first place. How was it that hundreds of thousands, if not millions, of people in Europe in the middle of the 20th century, thinking of themselves as good Christians, could go about murdering Jewish men, women, and children? And for that, centuries of Christian demonization of the Jews has certainly, I think, played an important role. And I've written a couple of books, one called The Popes Against the Jews, and then this one, The Pope and Mussolini, which the rabbi mentioned, and which deals particularly with the 1920s and 30s, to really get at what happened. And I think what we see, if we look clear-eyed at this history, is that the Nazis and the fascists in Italy leaned heavily on Christian materials in trying to turn their populations against the Jews and to regard the Jews as their mortal enemies. If we look at the next slide, just to give a little bit of historical background here, Mussolini comes to power in Italy in 1922. It's actually 11 years before Hitler does. Hitler comes to power in January 33 in Germany. And in fact, Mussolini becomes the role model for Hitler as he's trying to come to power throughout the 20s. And it was in 1929 that you see Mussolini there, together with the Secretary of State of the Vatican, Pietro Gasparri, signing a historic document, the Lateran Accords and the Concordat. This establishes Vatican City for the first time. Just a very little bit of Italian history. Italy, it was only formed in the 19th century. Before that, Italy was, the peninsula was a patchwork of different kingdoms and dukedoms and whatnot. And lying in the middle was the Papal States, where the Pope was also the king, as he had been for 1,000 years there. So the unification of Italy came only when the Italian army conquered Rome from the Pope in 1870. And at that time, the Pope excommunicated the Prime Minister, excommunicated the king, and said no good Catholic could show loyalty toward Italy as a nation state. So it was from 1870 to 1929, it took all this time until there was this rapprochement, and it came about through a deal with the dictator, through Mussolini. So there were very close relations between the Vatican and the fascist regime, although that would later become among the things denied. If we look at the next slide, then 9 years later, in 1938, the racial laws, the anti-Semitic campaign begins against the Jews in Italy. Of course, the famous Nuremberg laws came about 3 years earlier in Germany in 1935. This shot is taken actually from an anti-Semitic publication that the Italian government put out and shows what some of these laws are. So in 1938, all of a sudden, all Jewish children were thrown out of school. All Jewish teachers and professors were thrown out of their job. All Jewish civil servants, members of the military, Jews who work for banks, for other companies, they're all thrown out of work. And the Vatican does not complain. In fact, the fascist state uses Christian materials to justify its campaign, saying that as long as the popes had power in Rome, which they did until the previous century, they had confined the Jews to the ghetto and protected healthy Christian society from the depredations, the alleged depredations of the Jews. The one thing that the Church and the Vatican and the Pope did protest was insofar as the anti-Semitic laws affected people the Church regarded as Catholic, namely baptized Jews. From the Church point of view, the Pope would kept insisting baptized Jews were not Jews. They should not be treated as Jews. They should be not subject to the racial laws. If we look at the next slide, then, this was 1938, the racial laws come in February of 1939. The Pope Pius XI dies. As I mentioned, in his last months, he really turned against, particularly against Hitler, and especially angry at Mussolini, who had previously allied with, really. But he was angry with Mussolini's increasing embrace of Hitler. We often think of the relationship between the Vatican and these two totalitarian states, the two states of the Axis, Germany and fascist Italy, in the same light. But from the Vatican point of view, from the Pope's point of view, they're totally different. Italy and fascist Italy had carved out a special influential position for the Church, whereas from the Pope's point of view and the Vatican's point of view, the Nazis and Hitler was undermining the influence of the Church in Germany. So Pius XI, who was the Pope in the 20s and 30s, was not happy about Mussolini embracing Hitler. But then he dies, And in fact, his death, there was some speculation that it may have been hastened by Mussolini, but that's a bit of another story. And then if we look at the next slide, get some idea of the relationship going on, this fellow, Cesare Orsenigo, was the nuncio, essentially the ambassador from the Pope to the Nazi regime. He had been for since the beginning of the Nazi regime in 1933. And he was basically a fan of Hitler. And I've been reading the reports he was writing from Berlin throughout the 30s and in fact through the war years to the Vatican. And he was constantly basically making excuses for the Nazis. If we go to the next slide, it would be, so the war begins in 39 with the invasion September 1st, 39 by the Germans of Poland. Initially, Italy doesn't get involved. The Pope, now Pius XII, who we'll now be focusing on, is certainly not eager for Italy to join the war and does what he can to try to persuade Mussolini behind the scenes without ever complaining publicly, but behind the scenes urge him to keep Italy out of the war. But on June 10th, 1940, as the German troops were just sweeping through France, he joins the war. So now the Pope and the Vatican find itself in the middle of a capital of one of the Axis powers at war. Now, if we look at the next slide, all this history basically came to be denied by the Vatican, but I think it's important to put this in a somewhat broader framework. It's denied by Italy as well, as we'll get to. Those of us who spend time, and I spent many years living in Italy, you get the impression there that Italy fought on the side of the Allies during the war and not on the side of Hitler. But turning first to the Vatican here, I should say all this leading up to what's the big news item about this year, about 2020, which is finally, after years of pressure, the Vatican has opened the archives for World War II, the archives for the papacy of Pius XII. And I got to be one of the first people there, and along with my collaborator, who luckily is still there while COVID prevents me from going back, where I'm getting to read thousands of pages of newly available material from those archives that have just been opened in March of this year. But in the month before they were open, just to give you an idea of its apologetics and this denial of history, the Italian papers, and this is not a church paper, this actually is a paper identified with the kind of center left in Italy, La Repubblica, but a number of the major papers in Italy began publishing these articles about how the Pope was this great foe of fascism, the great foe of Hitler, great friend of the Jews, and so forth. And so this is a full page story, you see, from January of this year, just before the archives open. The headline reads, you see the translation there, thus Mussolini tried to stop Pope Pacelli. And it tells that when Pius XI died in February of 1939, that Mussolini and the fascists worked behind the scenes to do whatever they could to prevent Pacelli from coming to power because he was such an anti-fascist. And it's the opposite of the truth. In fact, we know from the diplomatic correspondence of both the Italian ambassador to the Holy See and the German, the Nazi ambassador to the Holy See, that they were working behind the scenes actively to promote the candidacy of Pacelli to become Pope. But as I mentioned, it's part of a larger denial of history that one finds in Italy, not just the Vatican. If you look at the next slide, give an example of it. So also this year in April, the major newspaper in Italy, Corriere della Sera, came out with a book series. It's one of these cheap versions of books. It was a series of a number of histories of fascism, one of which was my Pope Mussolini book, the Italian edition. And initially, you see on the left, the ad they had for it, which caused such trouble that they had to replace it with a new ad. The ad, if you look at the ad on the left for this book series about the history of fascism in Italy, it has a picture of smiling Mussolini and the adoring crowd listening to him. And it's the title in English would be The 2 Decades That Changed Italy, Well, this created an uproar because it indicated that Mussolini was popular, and not just that, but he somehow changed Italy. When the approved, kind of politically correct view of this history in Italy is that it was a historical parenthesis, that very few people were enthusiastic about the fascist regime. So they had to change the ad, and you see the new ad on the right there. They changed it to the 2 decades that convulsed Italy, and you have Mussolini looking kind of grim and unhappy, and absolutely nobody there to salute him. If we then go to the next page. So as I mentioned, March 2nd, 2020, after decades where, among others, the Jewish community has been insisting on the opening of the archives to see what role the Vatican in general and the Pope in particular played during the Holocaust. On March 2nd, it was open. This is a picture of me. Standing there next to me is Professor Hubert Wolf, who's one of the most renowned historians of this church Jewish relations and the church relations with the Nazi regime. He had brought with him that whole collection of people are all Germans who work in his academic unit. We're waiting there outside, inside the bowels of the Vatican, outside the door. That door you see is the door to the, what had been called the Vatican Secret Archives for some hundreds of years, until Pope Francis recently renamed it. Apparently the Secret Archives had a connotation he didn't like, and now it's called the Vatican Apostolic Archive. And you see the larger courtyard in which that archive is found, pictured on the left. The next slide, if we can go to, just to give people an idea. There's actually more than one archive that got open. There are various archives at the Vatican. And for those of people who may have seen the Vatican, you see St. Peter's Square there in the Bernini colonnade. There's a separate door where the Sant'Anna's Gate that one goes in, and you go into an internal courtyard that we just saw pictured in the previous picture. And that's where the 2 of the major Vatican archives are, the Vatican Apostolic Archive and the Secretary of State Archive. And a third archive that's also important, if one's interested in Vatican Jewish relations, is the Archives of the Inquisition. And I've shown that that's actually around the other side of the Vatican. And it's another place where I've been working. Well, I've sometimes been asked how I got interested in this history, and I hope I'm not going on too long, but just very briefly, and I'll end with this on this note. I actually have some personal history, you could say, at least through my father, because my father, if we look at the next slide, was the Jewish chaplain with the Allied troops that landed at Anzio. So in 1943, Italy deposed in July, the king deposed Mussolini, and a month later, the German army came down and essentially occupied all it could of Italy, except for the very far south where Allied troops from North Africa had already made their way. But they occupied Rome and would stay in Rome for 9 months. With the troops bottled up on the in the mountains south of Rome, there was a new Allied landing at the Anzio beachhead, which is 50 or so kilometers south of Rome. And my father was a rabbi and was the Jewish chaplain with the American Army, and he was the only Jewish chaplain there. This, curiously, is a shot of him holding a service connected with Passover in early April of 1944 in a wine cellar, because Anzio was actually under German constant bombardment from the mountains over it, overlooking it in April 1944. But finally, in the beginning of June of 1944, the troops from Anzio, other Allied troops, would break through, liberate Rome, and the Jews in Rome, who for 9 months had been in hiding, those who hadn't been picked up and sent to their death at Auschwitz, and there are about 2,000 who were murdered, largely at Auschwitz in concentration camps, who had been picked up, thanks in good part to Italian informants, by Gestapo and German SS. So the next slide is a kind of a happier scene, because a few nights after, it was a Sunday, I think, that Rome was liberated, that Erev Shabbat, so that Friday evening, they opened up the Grand Temple of Rome, which of course had been closed for the 9 months of German occupation. And my father co-led, representing the Allied forces, rabbi representing the Allied forces, co-led the service with the chief rabbi of Rome. Right before the service, a young GI, because in addition to, so you can imagine how dramatic a scene it was. The Jews who'd been in hiding came out. They're looking around to see who had survived of their relatives, of their friends, their fellow Jews of Rome. But there were also a couple of hundred Jewish GIs there as well. And one of them, a young man, came up to my father right before the service and said he had in fact he was from the Jewish community in Rome, but when the racial laws came in 1938, his family had sent him to the US, perhaps to relatives. He had subsequently, as he grew up, joined the US Army. He was with the forces that had liberated Rome. That's why he was there. But he was desperate to know whether his mother had survived the war, because he hadn't heard from her. And given, of course, what had happened and the chaos, so he asked, could my father make an announcement? And my father said, well, it'd be awkward for him to make an announcement because there were just so many cases like this. And he felt also the chief rabbi of Rome was really the one in charge. But he said, why don't you stand next to me when the Shabbos service begins? And I'm sure if your mother is in the synagogue, she will recognize you. And sure enough, as he stands next to my father as the service is about to begin, there's a shout from the synagogue, and this woman, the mother, rushes up, and somehow an artist captured this scene. It's actually quite a good likeness of my father in the background there. And this was printed in various Jewish papers through North America anyway. So this is a bit of just the personal history, which perhaps at least partly explains how I became interested in this.
Wow, what a beautiful overview. And that personal touch at the end was deeply moving. So, Professor, you clearly chose to not go in the family business, line of business. But you picked up on your father's story, and that is so moving. And that particular story is really powerful. How your father was able to facilitate in that subtle way the reunion of mother and son. Really, truly powerful. I want to pick up on some of the things you said, because you said so many interesting things in just a few short minutes. First of all, I was taken aback by the very real link you have made between the church and the Nazis. That is to say that the Nazis were inspired by the behavior of the church towards Jews, be it the ghetto or otherwise. And I found that very interesting. Is that link something that's universally accepted, or is that contested?
No, it's, first of all, it's not at all universally accepted, and of course rejected by the church and the Vatican. I would put matters though a little bit differently than you did. I wouldn't necessarily claim that the Nazis or Hitler was inspired by the church directly, but certainly they made great use of the history of church oppression of the Jews to justify what they were doing. They realized, well, certainly in Italy, where 99% of the population was Roman Catholic, but even in Nazi Germany, especially once they had taken over Austria and the Sudetenland, about half of the members of the Third Reich were Catholic, Roman Catholic. And so if you wanted to hit a responsive chord in demonizing the Jews, what would you do? Well, what you did is talk about how various popes saw the Jews as the enemy and dangerous, and how various church councils had denounced the Jews. And you could quote from Vatican-related newspapers, for example, Civiltà Cattolica, which still today is the Roman Jesuit publication overseen by the Vatican, whose pages have to be approved in advance before anything could be published, was filled with demonization of the Jews. including for the racial laws that, for instance, when Hungary introduced in 1938 its own version of the anti-Semitic laws, Civiltà Cattolica, its pages approved by the Vatican in advance, basically said how important this was, that states realized the dangers that Jews posed and the need to take measures against them. So that, of course, while the church and popes and church councils had never called for murdering the Jews, the notion that Jews were enemies, were dangerous, that something had to be done about them, this was very much part of a very long church tradition, which went right up to the beginning and into the years before itself.
Yes, thank you for actually, of course, refining that much more. I didn't mean the direct inspiration, but it does seem, if I understand correctly, that the 1,000-year plus persecution or attitudes of demonization towards the Jews really, in a certain sense, made the ground fertile for this to occur, without which it would have been much more challenging or difficult to sway an entire population. You know, there's something there was someone who came to see me some years ago, and he was creating a documentary about concentration camps in Italy. I think he said he had discovered that there were 10 or 11, something like that. I'm not sure if you're familiar with that, but I found that very interesting, that there were actually concentration camps within Italy.
There are actually two phases of concentration camps in Italy, which, you know, as you mentioned, aren't terribly well known. In the early years of the war, there were concentration camps set up primarily for foreign Jews. Because many German Jews, other Jews from Poland, elsewhere, fleeing persecution, came into Italy. And one of the first racial laws in August of 1938 specified that any foreign Jews would be ejected from the country, and that meanwhile they'd be put into concentration camps before they could figure out, you know, how to get rid of them. But then in 1943, after the Germans occupied Italy and Mussolini was set up as head of this puppet Nazi regime in the north of Italy, what was called the Republic of Italy, now, because the king was not in favor, it became a republic called the Social Republic of Italy, announced its new policy. Its new policy that announced was that all Jews should be immediately arrested, all their belongings should be seized, and they should be placed in concentration camps, which needed to be set up throughout the north of the peninsula, which is the area that the fascists and the Germans controlled. So there was a whole network of concentration camps set up for Jews in Italy.
Wow. I'm wondering about what prompted the opening of the archives. Furthermore, let me ask, did you have access to all of those archives or just that which related to World War II? In particular, I'm interested to know whether, if you did have greater access, you were able to go as far back as the destruction of the temple period. I know there's a lot of curiosity around that. You did mention the Inquisition. Just curious to know what prompted it, and what are some of the most surprising and maybe shocking findings that you made, and what more is there to come?
Well, there's a lot more, I think, to come, because they just opened these archives in a few months ago, and not just that, but then at the moment, for example, they're closed because of COVID. They were closed a couple of weeks ago, and we were hoping they'd get open pretty soon. But, you know, as we all know, this is all a matter for speculation. You have to realize how things work at the Vatican. You know, whereas other kinds of archives may have, you know, a 50-year rule. After 50 years, papers become available and so on. The Vatican, it's up to the current Pope to decide when to open the next materials that have yet to be opened. And it goes not by years, but by papacy. So you open, so in answer to your question, is it just the war years? No, because it's for the whole papacy of Pius XII. That's the way it works. And he was Pope from 1939 till 1958. So in fact, some of the more interesting material, including that Atlantic article I wrote in August that you mentioned about the Finale affair in France and the forced baptism case of the 2 Jewish boys there and their kidnapping. that deals with the period right after the war, and all that material I just found because it just became available. You know, if you're talking about earlier periods, theoretically that has been available for years, depending how far back one goes. In terms of surprising findings, for instance, for my book, The Pope of Mussolini, that we mentioned earlier, dealing with the 1930s, I discovered when they opened those archives, which were opened about 15 years ago, I guess, I found a document which showed that just before Mussolini was about to unveil the first racial laws, he reached an agreement behind the scenes, never previously revealed till my book, with the Pope to buy the Pope's silence with the anti-Semitic campaign in exchange for various benefits for the church. So that was pretty surprising document, dramatic document to find. In terms of the most recently opened archives, I would just mention one that I actually put in the appendix, or a couple of documents I put the transcription or translation in the appendix of that article, which was right after the roundup of the Jews, the initial roundup of the Jews of Rome, which was famously October 16th, 1943 by the Nazis. So let's just to get to the scene. The SS tries to find all the Jews they possibly can in Rome, both in the ghetto and other parts of the city, and spend hours herding frightened Jewish Jews, actually mainly women and children, because the Jewish community at that time was under the mistaken impression that just men were going to be in trouble with the Nazis. Only the men would be rounded up. So many of the men had fled. So they were rounded up over 1,000 Jews and put them in a holding area, literally just outside the walls of the Vatican, and kept them there for 2 days before they would be put on a train and sent to their death at Auschwitz. Well, the Pope was under great pressure to speak out, and he didn't. He didn't want to antagonize the Germans for various reasons we can talk about. But one of the documents that I found and I published in that Atlantic piece that seemed to make quite an uproar, including leading to a full-page denunciation in the pages of the Vatican Daily newspaper a week later, showed that one of the advisors of the Pope suggested that he at least privately speak out about the ongoing roundup of Jews, even beyond the 1,000. Another 1,000 Roman Jews would be rounded up over the next months and murdered, and even more further north in Italy. And I found both that document urging the Pope to speak out and the document that the Monsignor, who the Pope regarded as his main expert on Jewish matters, advised him against speaking out, even privately. This was not to speak out publicly. And they were both actually filled with the most anti-Semitic kind of language you can imagine. The person who wrote that, even more anti-Semitic kind of advice, and including not to speak out in any way against the ongoing murder of Italy's Jews, would later become the Cardinal Vicar of Rome. So the Church, apparently, the Vatican was not terribly happy with my article, and as I mentioned, it's led to the next week, the full page being devoted in L'Osservatore Romano, the Vatican's daily newspaper, trying to somehow undermine it.
But here's something that I wonder about. How could they put out any type of enunciation or rebuttal to a clear document that comes from their archives? That's question one. Question two is actually what goes on behind the scenes before an archive is opened. I mean, clearly the current Pope knows what's there. I cannot imagine he wasn't informed what type of explosive information would come to fore, really laying to rest, I think unequivocally, once and for all, this supposed controversy, and establishing it as a fact that Pope Pius XII was complicit and did not, not just publicly but privately, as you spelled out. What would go into his decision to allow it? Is it public pressure, or is there some actual behind the scenes? Do you think maybe as an is an individual, he wants the story to be told. Or there are powers that be that say it's time to acknowledge this fact. Or is it politics? Is it completely, does he have veto power? Is it down to the Pope? Or is there a group? How does it work? It seems to me like it's complex. And in a sense, the fact that they opened it up, knowing full well what would come from it, is in a certain sense a recognition that we're ready to start to deal with the demons of the past.
Yes, well, those are good questions. How do they deny it when I published their own document from their own archive?
Exactly.
Of course, they can't deny the existence. Well, I don't know if I mentioned this. In 1998, because of all this commotion about the concern about the role of the Vatican with respect to the Holocaust, after 11 years of study, a Vatican body headed by a cardinal with the preface of the report written by the Pope John Paul II came out with a statement called "We Remember." And it claimed that the Vatican and the Church had absolutely nothing to do with the kind of demonization of the Jews that led to the Holocaust. It made a distinction between what it called anti-Judaism and anti-Semitism, and said, well, unfortunately, some sons and daughters of the Church, not popes and cardinals and so on, had in the past been guilty of anti-Judaism, but that was simply based on religious negative ideas and had nothing to do with the Holocaust. Whereas anti-Semitism, which began in the late 19th century, focused on social, political, economic, racial kinds of questions, and that's what led to the Holocaust. And that's why I wrote the book, The Popes Against the Jews, to show that it has absolutely no basis in history, that in fact there is no such connection. And when that book came out, Civiltà Cattolica, the Vatican-overseen Jesuit journal I mentioned earlier, and a lead story of 20 pages attacking my book. So it began to teach me how this is dealt with. They kind of answer your question in this roundabout way. And basically the two main approaches, because you can't deny the actual evidence that I was citing, which was from their own archives, from the pages of their own journal, their horrendously anti-Semitic article after article after article. That was, by the way, constantly being cited by the fascist regime to justify its anti-Semitic campaign. So being unable to actually deny all that, they two things. They engage in ad hominem attack. The Jewish historian David Kurtzer says, and this kind of thing, and changing the subject, saying he didn't say anything about how the fact that Rabbi so-and-so in 1946 said what a wonderful savior of Jews the Pope was, and this kind of thing. So this is similar to what appeared in the Vatican newspaper just a couple of months ago in reaction to my Atlantic piece, which I think was the first significant report of findings from the newly opened archives. In terms of, didn't they realize when they opened the archives that this would come out? And that too is an interesting question. And I don't entirely know how to respond to it. Of course, authorities did resist opening these archives for, there have been these demands from the Jewish community, including from Jewish organizations for decades, to have these, particularly for the wartime period, opened, and they hadn't been. And so perhaps one explanation is they weren't that eager for these documents to be seen. But it was Pope Francis who finally authorized the opening. And although he has himself, on what little he said about Pius XII, tended to defend him, he's also called for greater transparency in the church and coming to terms with unfortunate, uncomfortable features of the church's history. And it's true that church organizations, most recently in Germany, but also France and elsewhere, have come to terms with, at least to some extent, with the responsibility of the national churches in failing to protest the Holocaust while it was happening, but the Vatican has not.
David, it sounds to me like you are, if not public enemy number one, way up there to these more, if you will, whitewashing elements within the Vatican, because you have literally dedicated a few books to shining a very important light on this darker side of the Vatican history, which is an important story to be told. It's silenced by a religious body with tremendous influence, by individuals who are meant to represent the highest morals. The fact that this roundup took place and it was literally outside the walls of the Vatican is gut-wrenching, and is a stain on the Pope, on the Pope's legacy. And I think this needs to gain much wider audience. And I think the fact that you're seeing that type of backlash is itself testament to the importance of the work that you do. So first of all, tremendous kol hakavod, as we say, for going out there and putting yourself out there to tell this story. A few quick questions. First of all, maybe this isn't something we want to get into in depth, but you said there were rabbis who came out defending. What would have been their motivation? And more particularly, what's the Italian Jewish community's view on Pope, Pius XII, and specifically exposing this story? Are they uncomfortable? If it's something that the man on the street is really deeply uncomfortable with, as in the Italian wider Gentile population, is the Jewish community's take on all this, let's keep under the radar? Or are they reaching out to you to encourage you to go out there and tell this story? Are they afraid of repercussions? What's the Jewish Italian view on all of this?
Well, this has changed actually over the years. As you kind of touched upon, right after the war, I think it wasn't just the Christians, Catholic majority in Italy, who wanted to bury this history and in fact reinvent a history that never occurred, in which it wasn't, the Italians had nothing to do with the Holocaust. It was all, the Germans' fault and so forth. And it was in the interest, it seemed really psychologically, a number of historians have said recently, in the interest of the Jews of Italy to try to go along with that narrative, that in fact, they were welcome in Italy. Their Catholic neighbors always looked kindly upon them and would never have gone along with their persecution. But in more recent years, I think people are thinking, no, we need to really come to terms and understand what happened. And certainly the current chief rabbi of Rome, Riccardo Di Segni, whom I've gotten to know a bit, has certainly been very much encouraging me. In fact, when they were about to open the archives March 2nd, he asked me to come to his office at the synagogue, which I did the day before the opening, so I guess March 1st. And we spent an hour talking, and he certainly was very encouraging of my work and the importance of doing it. So that's certainly gratifying for me as well.
Wow. Have you at any point felt threatened? Did you ever feel unsafe doing this work? It's a personal question. I don't know. Maybe it's a dramatic question, but I'm curious.
Yes. Well, I guess don't publish my address here. I mean, seriously, I sometimes get asked that question. No, really, I haven't felt that. I mean, it's unpleasant. I'm an academic, and academics, we're used to getting involved in arguments with other academics, but it's all kept at a certain kind of abstract level and doesn't become personal. So, some of this kind of material, and I was talking about Vatican-related publications. That's one thing, but in fact, for the right wing of the church, Pius XII is a great hero, and anything which is seemed to undermine that heroic image is seen as greatly threatening. So if you go on, the web, you can certainly find some pretty vicious attacks on me from those quarters. So, why is Pius XII great hero of the right wing of the church? Is because the Jews have a lot to do with it, because it was with his successor, John the 23rd, who convened the Second Vatican Council, that the centuries-long demonization of the Jews by the church was brought to an end. And that was a major part of the Second Vatican Council. And it was the Second Vatican Council that, from the right-wing point of view of the church, is where the church went wrong. And in fact, if you go on Twitter, for those for viewing, I don't know whether anyone follows Twitter, but probably similar social media as well, and you put Pius XII in any day, you'll find various people saying that was the last pope. After Pius XII, there hasn't been a legitimate pope. And they're, cool for the Jews of the Masons or whatever. So there's some pretty vicious stuff out there.
Wow. I want to jump to, and then come back to this maybe in a little bit. I want to jump to what I found one of the most fascinating and gripping books, the book you wrote about Edgar Martaro, that a Jewish child who was secretly baptized by his nanny, unbeknownst to his parents. And the child was subsequently kidnapped by the church, claiming that once baptized, according to church doctrine, regardless of the circumstances of that baptism, the child belongs to Christianity. Of course, it's an incredible read. Highly, highly recommended. It tells a very important chapter in the history of Jewish-Vatican relations, which had huge ramifications, including, as you mentioned, the unification of Italy, which I imagine is why Steven Spielberg, who is obviously the great director, has taken an interest in this, because it's a story where it seems like one relatively local or minor event has national and really global ramifications. And a more recent example of this controversial doctrine came to head after the war. You mentioned it briefly earlier, when two Jewish children, Robert and Gerald Finale, were held by the church on similar grounds. Can you share a brief overview of that story and the involvement of Pope Pius XII?
Yes, in fact, my the Atlantic article that was mentioned that came out in August, but I think it's freely available for anybody who's interested online. Report some of the, as I mentioned, the first findings really from these newly opened archives that have to do with the immediate post-war period. So, but as you suggest, Rabbi, this was part of a many centuries long practice of the church, that where Jewish children were baptized, even against the knowledge and will of their parents, they were regarded as Catholic and therefore could not be raised by Jews, so had to be seized from the Jewish parents and raised in Catholic institutions. This was the case of Edgardo Mortara in Bologna in 1858, when Bologna was still part of the Papal States, and so the Pope had police powers as well, which allowed him to take the children and keep this child, Edgardo, from his parents. But the post-war case is one of a larger phenomenon that the Jewish community was very concerned about at the end of the war, because there were many thousands of Jewish orphans of the Holocaust whose parents had been carted off to concentration camps and murdered, but one way or another, the children had been spared, hiding out in various places, including various Catholic institutions, which fortunately took them in to save them. But in some of these cases, these children were baptized, and if they were baptized from the church point of view still then, they should not be returned to their Jewish home. And so this was the case, as you mentioned, of the Finale boys. The case, very briefly, was this. The parents, who were Jews living in Grenoble in southeastern France, who in early 1944 were picked up by the Gestapo, taken to Auschwitz, where they were murdered. The children ended up with a Catholic woman locally, who kept them hidden for the last few months of before liberation by the Allies in France, even before the war ended, but after France had been liberated. So February 45, the surviving sisters of their father got in touch with this woman, thanked her for protecting their two young children. They were born in 41, 42, so they were 1 and 2 or so when their parents were taken away to the concentration camp. They had been circumcised. Their parents were practicing Jews and were eager for their children, despite what was going on in France and Europe at the time, to be proud of their Jewish identity. Well, the woman refuses to give the children back to the parents, to the relatives, to the aunts, and she has various kind of anti-Semitic things to say. And over the next few years, I won't go into the details because it takes a while, but as the courts began a series of orders that she should return these children to their family, she refuses, and with the support of a kind of underground network of nuns and monks, spirits them from one monastery and convent to another. Eventually, in the beginning of 1953, when this really becomes a huge scandal in France, leads to hundreds and hundreds of newspaper articles, the group of monks spirit them across the Spanish border to a monastery in Basque Land, Spanish Basque Land. So what I discovered in these newly opened archives this year was a long correspondence between the leaders of the church in France, particularly the Cardinal Archbishop of Lyon, and the Pope, and the men around the Pope and the Secretary of State, but also documentation in the Holy Office, formerly the Holy Office of the Inquisition, about what to do. Should these children be returned to their Jewish family or not? And what I discovered is that although what was going on in France was pretty well known, it was not known until my discoveries in the Vatican archives that just were open this year, that the Pope was basically directing the people in the church in France to not return the children to the Jewish relatives, if at all possible, to keep them from them, thus continuing the church doctrine, church policy that had been around for centuries and that had in fact explained the case of Edgardo Mortara back in the 19th century. If you could put up, I think I did provide a view. One thing I didn't mention, if that last slide that I had could be put up. So finally, the French authorities have jailed the woman who originally took the boys, plus a whole number of monks and nuns, charging them with kidnapping. The two boys, now 10 and 12 years old, are brought back, and the sister of their father, so this is their father's sister that you see there, is Israeli. So she went in the 30s to escape the persecution in Vienna. She had gone to Palestine, and it's now, of course, we're in 1953, so it's Israel. And she is there. This is showing her when she first gets to meet her two nephews. And later that month, this is July 1953, much to the anger of the Pope, as I discovered in the newly opened archives, she puts them, or takes them on a flight back to her home in Israel, where they would be raised and where they're to be found now, no longer quite so young, in Israel.
Wow, I mean, it's absolutely shocking. This stuff just doesn't end. You know, there's World War II. You could say he had political considerations, which we don't even. I don't know what their official defense is for Pope, Pius XII, but this is really outlandish. And my question to you is: has the Vatican have efforts been made to reform such doctrines? This is something I've been wondering about. These doctrines are at the heart of this historical animosity and really persecution of individual kids from families, which is brutal by any standard. Have efforts been made to eradicate or uproot this particular doctrine among other doctrines that have been at the heart of this historical anti-Semitism coming from the church?
Well, first in the broader context, very importantly, in part of really coming out of the Second Vatican Council in 1965, the Vatican Declaration was released, Nostra Aetate, which ended the doctrine that Jews were collectively responsible for the murder of Jesus and so on, the deicide, and that the Jews were therefore condemned by God to wander the earth as a condemned people for all eternity until they saw the light and became Christian. So this was very important change in church policy toward the church. The specific doctrine, curiously, about baptism, baptizing Jewish children against the will of their parents, hasn't changed. I was kind of amazed by this myself. And in fact, in the Atlantic piece, have a link to the official Vatican canon law page today, which suggests that if a Christian, a Catholic, see a Jewish child or a non-Christian child in danger of death, it would be a good thing, even against the advice of the parents or the knowledge of the parents, to baptize that child or those children. The difference, of course, is the church doesn't have the police power it did in the Papal States in the case of Edgardo Mortara. So it may be that these kind of cases no longer have grave implications, but it is kind of curious that doctrine has not been changed.
Exactly. It's definitely not something that, by modern standards, makes it's in any way, shape, or form correct or appropriate. I want to jump into an interesting thing in passing. You touched on it. We know of numerous instances where rabbis came from England or the US and elsewhere to try to retrieve and rescue Jewish children who had been saved by the church or by nuns or convents or private Christian families during the war. Was there an official church policy relating to the return of these children after the war? And here's something I'm personally very curious about. Throughout your research, have you come across data or estimates of how many such children were lost to the Jewish people?
Yeah, for the latter question, no. I mean, I've seen estimates, but they're just so wide-ranging from, a few thousand to many tens of thousands. I think, presumably Poland would be the epicenter, just because that's where, there were 3.3 million Jews in Poland before the war, and 90% are murdered. And after the war, very few are left because of those who survived and then go back. They're subjected to pogroms themselves and end up in Israel or elsewhere. So it's thought that there probably were many thousands of Jewish children who survived in Poland, but parents were murdered. But also, if France, the Finale case is one of probably a number. It's believed in Holland and other parts of Europe, something similar, because first of all, those who were saved by non-Jewish families were Christian families, and a certain proportion of them certainly were Catholic. Plus, as you mentioned, Catholic institutions, in some cases nobly and at some risk, took in Jews and Jewish children. So we really don't know. We do know that the organized Jewish community was sufficiently concerned about this that not only were various international Jewish aid organizations set up specifically for trying to reclaim these Jewish orphans of the war, Jewish orphans of the Holocaust, but the chief rabbi of Israel, Rabbi Yitzhak Herzog, traveled through Europe right after the war in 1946 to try to bring attention to this problem. And one of his major visits was to the Pope, to Pius XII. That we now do have, well, we already had his record of his conversation with the Pope, but now I've had also these newly available Vatican documents, what was going on, how the Pope and those around him viewed the rabbi's visit. So he was calling on Pius XII to issue a kind of directive to Catholics worldwide to make known any such Jewish children who were still in Catholic hands and return them to their Jewish families. He refused to do that. That's part of the story that can now be told with the documents. They tried to put off the rabbi in the internal documents, say, whatever we do, we shouldn't put anything in writing because it'll be exploited by the Jews. And for Jewish propaganda. The instructions were, because they put off the rabbi till he went back to Jerusalem, they instructed the papal delegate in Jerusalem to only orally tell them, not that the Pope was going to put out a statement, but that if you knew of any particular cases, you should bring them to the Vatican's attention, and they would do their best to look into them.
Wow, it just keeps coming back to doctrine, but also the stewards of doctrine. In the end, I think it's not just the doctrine, it's who's in charge and how they execute that doctrine. And in his case, Pope, Pius XII, and also in the Edgar Martoro case, where, as you write brilliantly about, the Pope went to such great lengths against tremendous pressure brought to bear internationally. It comes down to those individuals in power and their stubbornness, and in a sense, their stubbornness / humanity, or I would argue absence thereof. Very, very heart-wrenching period.
I mean, certainly from conservative traditionalist point of view in the church, it's not stubbornness, it's sticking up for, the word of God kind of thing. And, Pius IX, the Pope who insisted, as you mentioned, against great political pressure, insisted on keeping the Jewish child Edgardo, who was 6 years old, away from his family, despite the fact, you know, in the United States, there were demonstrations of 3,000 people in San Francisco, 2,000 in New York. Right. The king, the emperor in France got involved and was protesting, insisting that the Pope return the child to his family. So the Pope saw himself as, in fact, he said, it's unclear whether this was apocryphal or not, that he said to the boy, Edgardo, you are very dear to me. You have cost me my kingdom, because subsequent to his taking Edgardo, he in fact would lose the Papal States, partly because of the changed position of France and the French emperor, who wasn't happy with what he was doing with this Jewish child. In the year 2000, to celebrate the millennial year, John Paul II, on the same day, beatified, a step right before becoming saint, two of his predecessors. One, the kind of heroes of the liberals of the church, John XXIII, who presided over the Second Vatican Council, and it was Pius XII's successor. But the other was earlier. He actually was interested in beatifying Pius XII, apparently, but because of the controversy about his silence during the Holocaust, didn't feel he could, and instead took another Pius, who was a hero of the conservatives, namely Pius IX, the one who insisted on keeping Edgardo Mortara from his Jewish family. And the Jewish community of Rome did protest that beatification.
So let me ask you this. You know, you mentioned a little bit earlier about what brought you into the story personally, your father's connection. But what is, you know, every author has a point to writing a book. Obviously, there's, like, you know, in the journalistic, shining a light on an important piece of history. But there's an intended outcome, I imagine. There's an objective. And I wonder whether, in your case, this is about telling the story and maybe even eliciting the acknowledgement in public, even apology. So it brings me as the church in action and silence about the fate of the Jews and about this, the long-standing demonization of the Jews. You did mention the Second Council, which is obviously a major game changer, I would imagine. And can you share with us very briefly some of the progress in this area?
Well, I would say, you know, in terms of what I'm trying to do, first of all, as a scholar, I've been interested in trying, I view this history as very important history, not just the particular question of church and the Jews, but understanding, for example, fascism, understanding the Second World War, understanding really 2 centuries of European and Italian history, that too often I think scholars just write in language that only one another reads. And I find this not only important, but also fascinating. And so I've been trying in my books for the last 20 years to write books based in the archives with much new to say to scholars, but written in a way that is attractive to a much broader audience. With the specific question, you know, these kind of questions we've been discussing this evening, yes, I mean, I think, as I mentioned, my book, Popes Against the Jews, about the role of the Vatican and the rise of modern anti-Semitism, really was written as a response to the Vatican's official denial through We Remember that its demonization of the Jews had anything to do with the Holocaust. And similarly, right now, the book I'm working on, which is on Pius XII and his relationships with Mussolini and Hitler during the war, and of course includes the story of his relationship to and reactions to the ongoing murder of Italy's and Europe's Jews, is being written in part to set the record straight, I guess you could say, about that history, because it's a history that's been denied. But as I mentioned, not just by the church, it's part of a larger denial of this history in Italy and to an extent in France and Austria and other parts of Europe.
Hi, Professor. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you now.
I apologize. Well, tonight's talk highlighted a darker side of Jewish history. I usually like to conclude our talk on a positive note. And so I'd like to ask you, as a final question, can you share beautiful anecdotes or stories of heroism and humanity that you came across in your research, and perhaps share as well any good news or positive?
Yes, I mean, there are various other sides of the story which are much more positive. First of all, I should say that I'm not the only one working this history, and it's not just Jewish scholars who are doing so. There's work being done and has been done on this history by a number of important Catholic scholars. I showed a picture waiting for the opening day of the archives of Professor Hubert Wolf. He's a priest as well as a historian, professor of history, and his publications are very important ones that is looking frankly at this history. There are a number of other Catholic authors like Gary Wills in the US, James Carroll, who've written about this history as well. So I think it's encouraging that in the church itself, there is a movement to come to terms with this history. And it's not just from the Jewish community that we're throwing stones. I feel I'm working together with various colleagues, many of whom, in fact, are priests, in trying to come to terms with this history. And, it's part of a larger, it's not just Christians and Jews these days. If you talk about religious demonizations of others, it involves, all too many other religious groups as well. So this is a history that I think we're all have a stake in coming to terms with. Apparently the rabbi's having trouble connecting but I do see in the comments, there's a question about whether I think documents might have been removed or destroyed from the archives before they were open. And this is, in fact, a question that many scholars who work there ask as well. And it's a little bit hard to answer it. I would say this, that certain kinds of documents are not made available to scholars. So that, for example, what they refer to as personnel documents are not available. And that's why there's never, as far as I know, been any study, for instance, of the sex abuse scandal in the church done based on Vatican archives, because those documents, insofar as they exist, are not made available. In theory, all other documents should be made available. I've been told that by the bishop who directs the main Vatican archive. But there's kind of another part to the story. Pius XII, we look at that story, was a very cautious kind of man. And he often would suggest not putting things in writing, which might be in some way compromising later on. And so this is kind of a related problem, that there may be important discussions that took place that never had a written record left of them.
Wow, Professor, the hour is late, and I want to wrap up what has been an absolutely fascinating and inspiring conversation. Thank you so much for your time and for your effort and energy. We can't thank you enough for joining us tonight, and I want to bless you with continued good health and prosperity and serenity and nachas from your family and from the work that you do